LifePoint students online, and just very excited to be in week 6 now of our Big Story of the Bible series. It's been ongoing, and we got quite a few more to go through because it is a big story, and we are trying to cover as much as possible. If you recall, when I first started this series, we kind of mentioned that this is kind of more of really foundational pieces of a greater story. And really, what we're talking about today is the culmination of really the only part of the story that matters, is the focal point, which is Jesus. And that's really where we're starting today. And we'll kind of continue next week, but really want to talk about Jesus as the central figure, Jesus as the if you're a real story person, the protagonist of the story. But it's more than a story because we're talking about history. We're talking about, in fact, God using all of this history to bring about an actual person, more than a person, fully God. So we're talking about that figure who is Jesus and that role he has to play in the Bible and in our lives today. So before I get too far ahead of myself, let's really kind of really focus in on our kind of point of the day, which is that Christ is the fulfillment of the old covenant. We remember we talked a lot about covenant and how that's more than just a promise. It is a promise, but it's also an agreement as well. But Christ is the fulfillment of that old covenant, starting back with Abraham. And really that everything in the Old Testament points towards Jesus Christ. And to kind of really boil that down is that Jesus is the climax of the entire big story of the Bible. Everything starts pointing to him, and everything after him refers back to him. So when you think about that, everything really kind of centers on Jesus. So let's actually talk a little bit about who is Jesus Christ. Well, Christ alone, as basically I'm trying to point out, is that he is the central figure of not just the Bible, but really history. And I say that because, really, if you think about it, there's no one in history more controversial, for many, discussed, worshipped, loved, and even by some hated. But as just a figure in history, no one has been more talked about. And I think that's why he is not only the central figure of, obviously, the Word, but more than that, of history itself. So, he is the second person of the Trinity. Christ is perfectly unified with God the Father and the Holy Spirit. John 16 is where we derive that. He is completely God and completely man. When he came to earth as the Christmas baby, he took on flesh completely 100%, but he did not give up his complete 100% godhood. So while here and in through his ministry, he was both 100% God, 100% man, and in his death and resurrection, he took off the complete human side, but still has and always will remain that part of God, that part of the Trinity that is fully and completely God. So Jesus, as we understand him, is the exact representation and form of God. Philippians 2:6. Jesus experienced all that it means to be human. We see that in Hebrews chapter 2. So even in his humanness, he knows what you and I endure. He knows and understands firsthand what it means to struggle against temptation. But also, unlike us, he was able to not succumb or give in to all of that. He is the only path to salvation. John 14:6 says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So that is a very definitive and true statement. So while we may sometimes seek other paths, while people may struggle with finding other answers or other truths, there really is no other truth because even Jesus says there's only one truth, and that is him. What Christ did on earth, Christ fulfilled prophecy. He completed the old covenant, as we said, and brought in the new covenant. So by completing or ending that chapter of the old, really maybe let's say it that way, kind of ending the chapter of the old covenant, then therefore brought in a new covenant. Not because God was changing his mind, not because God thought of a better idea. In fact, we know through this series, this was God's plan all along. So the covenant was only to be a holdover till Christ. It was to be a bridge, I guess, of sorts, till we reach that point of time when Christ would come and then establish maybe we say new covenant, but really the perfected covenant through Christ. In the Old Covenant, it's laws. Remember, it's Deuteronomy, Leviticus. A lot of the Old Testament is God telling Moses, and Moses telling the people, or God telling a prophet, and the prophet telling the people what they can and can't do, or what is appropriate. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Not what we do's and don'ts, but what's appropriate, what's holy, and what isn't. And so there's laws. Under that Old Covenant, it was laws. It was sacrifices. If you sin, go sacrifice this, and it's for that atonement of sin, for that forgiveness of sin. It's feast, it's rituals, but to us, we look back and they seem, well, that's just what they did. No, in fact, that was always meant to be a foreshadowing of who Christ would be and what he would do. So this established idea that you need to sacrifice something to have atonement for sin, to sacrifice something for the forgiveness of sin. The idea of following, like these rituals. But again, it's always trying to establish in the mind of the Jews, who were supposed to take that truth and bring it to the world, these ideas, which they often failed to do, like we said last week and in the week before. So in their failure to do that, they didn't bring that understanding of these ideas of the covenant, which would have gotten the world used to the arrival of Jesus. And because they failed to do so, the world wasn't, when Jesus arrives, the world wasn't quite as ready, in our view, in my view, as it could have been. However, God's not surprised by that. God's plan is still on track because Jesus arrives. So Jesus completes that old covenant, and then he starts to establish the new one. But more than that, Jesus Christ fulfilled prophecy. We talked about this before, I mentioned it, but he fulfilled 300, give or take, probably more like give, Old Testament prophecies about his first coming. And here's just a few examples. So let's walk through this real quick. He was a descendant of David. It was prophesied in 2 Samuel, fulfilled in Matthew 1. He was born in Bethlehem, prophesied in Micah 5, and it was fulfilled in Luke chapter 2. Born of a virgin, prophesied in Isaiah 7, fulfilled in Matthew 1, verse 23. There was prophecies about his ministry. His ministry would begin in Galilee, and that was prophesied in Isaiah 9, but it was fulfilled in Matthew 4. He would bear the sins of others, or basically all mankind, and that was prophesied in Isaiah 53, but fulfilled in Romans 15. He would enter the temple with authority. That was prophesied in Malachi 3, verse 1, and fulfilled in John 2, 13 through 22. There was other prophecies about his death and resurrection. He would be portrayed for 30 pieces of silver. That was prophesied in Zechariah 11, but it was fulfilled in Matthew 26. His hands and feet would be pierced. That was prophesied in Psalm 22, but fulfilled in John 19. He would rise from the dead. Prophesied in Psalm 16, fulfilled in Matthew 28. Now, there's a lot of math here. Someone much smarter than me, a man named Peter Stoner, did a lot of the calculations on this. So let's see what he has to say. Basically, he says the odds of Jesus, or anyone for that matter, but really Jesus is the only one who matches this at all, fulfilling just 8 of these messianic promises, 8 of the 300. And I think we probably mentioned about 8. So just the 8 of the messianic promises have been calculated as to 1 out of 10 to the 17th power. I wanted to say it right. So basically 1 with 17 zeros behind it. So that's just 8. And so you can imagine then how incalculable 300 actual prophecies would be. Not just necessarily about who he is, but who he is, where he would go, what he would do, how he would eventually come back as well. Those are other prophecies. So the point is that he met all of these prophecies, and yet there's still more about his second coming, and which we could get into a little bit more later. But the point is that he fulfilled all the ones already. We have to wait and see or experience what the other prophecies have to do with him and how those will be fulfilled. But ultimately, my point is that Jesus fulfilled all of this already. And Christ, therefore, again, completed the Old Covenant. The entire Old Testament law pointed to Jesus, as we were saying, because the law and these prophecies go together. And through all that, through the law, which especially dealt with the sacrificial system, again, you sin, you have to go to the temple, and for whatever that sin is, you have something sacrificed, a dove, a lamb. And so Jesus completes or ends the sacrificial system because Jesus becomes the perfect sacrifice. We read that in Hebrews 9. He becomes the perfect sacrifice, so do you need the sacrificial system anymore? No, especially according to Jesus. Jesus made us the temple. How? Because in Israel, the temple was the dwelling place of God. We talked about that before, the importance of that building within the very culture of the Jewish people. The very temple itself, more than a building, but to them it was the epicenter of everything. And understandably, again, the idea was that people would see like the importance of going there and being part of that culture. Again, a foreshadowing of Jesus. But how does Jesus but how does Jesus bring that more to fulfillment? Well, he brings, for us Christians, he brings his dwelling place within us. So we no longer have to go to a place to be with God. We have him with us if we invite him in and accept him in. Again, that's not a doing away with, that's not a change, it's a perfecting of. It is a bringing maybe more to what the law was always meant to be, but you had to wait through so much for Jesus to bring it about. Jesus became our high priest. How so? Priests in the Jewish order, in the Jewish tradition, had to perform the sacrifices on behalf of the Israelites. However, how does Jesus, his presence, perfect that? How does he bring it to its fullness? Maybe Christ became our sacrifice and removed the human need, the need for a human priest. So in a way, Christ is the ultimate sacrifice, but he's also the one who does the sacrifice. So he does away with the priestly order. For us, we don't need that, especially outside the Jewish tradition, because he is the priest who, in a sense, does the sacrificing of himself. So in all of this, you can see how, again, some people might say he replaces some. I like this idea that Jesus brings it more to its fullest and most complete understanding of this idea of covenant. But for the sake of argument, for the sake of discussion, Christ establishes this new covenant because in the new covenant was we say a complete change, and in a way it certainly was. But the old covenant was like a bridge that you had to cross to get to Jesus. And once you did that, it's kind of like closing. The old covenant was like a closing of an old chapter, and that you're starting a new chapter. So we went from, in the old it was law, truly. In the old law, it was law. And then we moved to grace, because under the old covenant, Israel was bound by the law and had to continually justify, do the sacrifices and things like that, and do the rituals. They had to re-justify themselves in God's eyes by sacrificing, like I said, animals to atone for their sin. We see that in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But under the new covenant, Jesus has become our sacrifice. As I said, his death in our place, we are eternally and continually justified. Now, again, there's a step there. I want to be clear. You have to have him dwelling within you, and the only way to do that is to invite him and accept him in as your Lord and Savior, which is where that justification, begins. But that making you new and making you alive is a whole other word called sanctification, which, again, I don't want to jump ahead to next week too much, but that sanctifying, or basically renewing of it, making us alive now, is the beginning of the process. So again, under the old covenant, it was only for Israel to kind of be this model to the rest of the world. But then under Jesus, everything about God, especially Jesus, is now available to all people. Because again, like I said, the old covenant was meant for the Israelites, and only they could be rewarded if they were obedient, or they would be disciplined, as we talked a lot last week, if they broke the covenant. Well, under the new covenant, it applies to all of us. Again, you have to make that step. You have to make that commitment to accepting Christ. But once done, he is for you. No matter who you are, where you are. You still have to make that step. Now, we can talk about who really makes the step. Is it all God? Is it part us? That's a topic for another day, and a worthy one at that. But ultimately, however you want to cut it, the point is that in Jesus making it all happen, or making it capable to happen, is the only thing that brings us into that new covenant. So, as we kind of draw to a close, Christ brought God's kingdom to earth. And that kingdom is now, in that if you accept Christ, you can take part in that kingdom, but it goes further, because while it's now, it's still not fully yet, if that makes any sense. So for those of us who have Christ now, or if you're questioning or wondering, and you make that step, and he does dwell within you now, well, you are part of the kingdom, so it is now. But I think maybe something that highlights this a little bit more closely is 1 Corinthians 13:12, which goes to say, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known." And I think we'll close it there, but I think the point is, as that passage from Corinthians says, if we have Christ now, then we enjoy part of the kingdom of God now. But what that passage is saying is that it's like a very dim view. It's a very dim vision of what it will be ultimately. So imagine the relationship and bond that you share now, and if you could envision, as Corinthians is saying, we will know fully, because what we have now is such a dim view. Maybe our humanness, our struggle with sin, our pride, whatever, gets in the way. Basically our human shell. And then eventually we will get beyond that, where we dwell with Christ and God forever, which is where it becomes more full, more a very bright vision, a true vision. So I do hope that with this that you are encouraged, because Jesus, as again, is more than just a historical figure. He is certainly that, but he is the only figure I think we need to dwell on, really, and see how that impacts and influences our lives, because it will if you let him. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful and blessed day, and we'll talk to you. Bye.